And of course, if you want to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself as we go through the class. Okay, let's get started. Today, we're going to talk about a word, a four-letter word. It's called fear. And in the context of describing our relationship with God, one of the first things that we talk about is the need to accept God's authority. It's one of the most fundamental principles of our faith. And even though it makes some people feel uncomfortable that, I have to submit to an authority, but really, Judaism is based on following the Torah, studying the Torah, and fulfilling the mitzvot, God's commandments. And in order to do that, we have to submit to God's authority. Now, in the Shema, those of you who are familiar, we have the Shema prayer that we recite twice a day, morning and evening. And there are 3 paragraphs of the Shema as we recite them in our daily prayers. But actually, in the Torah itself, these 3 paragraphs are not adjacent to each other. And they're not even recited in the order in which they appear in the Torah. So how do we know that this is the full version of the Shema prayer? The order is significant, and this comes from the Talmud. The rabbis in the Talmud, Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha said, why, when reciting Shema, does the portion of Shema, which is paragraph number 1, precede V'haya im Shamoah, which is paragraph number 2? The reason is so that one first accepts upon themselves the authority of the kingdom of heaven, and only then accept upon themselves the authority of the mitzvahs, which appear in the paragraph of V'haya. So in other words, you have to understand the theme of each paragraph. First paragraph is about accepting God's authority. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Once we accept the authority of God, then we can talk about following his commands. But that's the sequence. Now, in Hebrew, there's a term, Yirat Shamayim, which literally translates into fear of heaven. In other words, there's the central component in Judaism, which is accepting God's authority. And what does it mean to accept God's authority with a sense of fear? So the Tanya explains, the Tanya is considered like the Bible of Chabad Hasidic thought. It was written by Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, who lived in the 18th century. And he writes about, this is basically a guide to how to serve God. And he writes as follows: one must constantly bear in mind the first step of religious service and what lies at its very core. Now, conventionally, fear is the primary driver behind abstaining from prohibited behaviors, whereas love is the primary driver motivating positive behavior. However, love alone is really not enough to drive good behavior. Rather, at the very least, it's critical to draw upon the natural fear every Jew has deep in their heart, not to rebel against God. Work must be done to bring this natural fear into the full expression in the heart of our mind. A Jew must accept upon themselves God's authority and sovereignty so that they may serve him in every way. So really, in terms of human emotions, nobody likes fear. Fear is, everybody likes love and acceptance. Why talk about fear? So we have to understand that fear is not fear of punishment. It's not fear of something that's going to harm me or the consequences of my actions. If I have the privilege of having a relationship with someone, I'm afraid of ruining that relationship. I'm afraid of doing something which will undermine the friendship. And the same thing goes with our relationship with God. If I'm truly aware and conscious of the privilege that I have to have a relationship with God, then the fear is I'm afraid of doing something that will contradict God's wishes because that will ruin this relationship. So love is important, but fear is another factor which is just as important. I'm afraid of doing something that will undermine this very special relationship that I have with God. You with me?
Yes.
Okay. So now that we have established the basic idea of yirat shamayim, fear of heaven, to be in awe and have a sense of reverence in God's presence, let's take a mitzvah from this week's Torah reading that will help us understand this concept even further. It's the mitzvah of hakel. Okay, so this was a septennial event. It happened once in 7 years during the times of the temple, where the entire Jewish people would gather. Let's read it first in the words of the Torah. Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, at an appointed time, during the festival of Sukkot, after the year of release, so it was after the sabbatical year, when all Israel comes to appear before God in the place he will choose, you shall read this Torah before all Israel in their ears. Assemble the people, the men, the women, and the children, and your stranger in your cities, in order that they hear and in order that they learn and fear God, and they will observe to do all the words of this Torah. And their children who did not know will hear and learn to fear God all the days that you live on the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess. So it's really a fascinating mitzvah because think about the context. Moses is about to pass away, and the Jewish people are poised to enter the promised land and assume their national identity. The Jews are given two final mitzvahs at the very end of the Torah. One is to write a Torah scroll, and two is this mitzvah called hakel, to gather once in 7 years in the temple and listen to the king of Israel read the words of the Torah. And there were selections of the Torah that the king would read. And the purpose, what is the reason for this gathering? It says right there in verse 12, in order that they learn and fear God. So imagine this massive ceremony, millions of people coming together from all the tribes, men, women, children. And what's the objective? To instill fear. not only for those present, but for future generations, so that your children too will learn to fear God. And so we come back to our question, why fear? Isn't fear considered a negative and counterproductive way to motivate people? Out of all the tools that God could have used to inspire the people, why focus on fear? Parent or a teacher can scream at a child, can threaten them, and the child will submit in the short term. But we all know that in the long term, love and positive reinforcement is a much better motivator than fear. So why does Judaism advocate this concept to instill in us a fear of heaven? And this whole ceremony that took place in the temple, bringing together all Jews from all corners of the world, why? To motivate them to fear God. So the answer is that obviously we are not really understanding the true meaning of fear, especially in this context. In order to appreciate what fear of heaven really means, let's delve a little bit deeper into this mitzvah, the mitzvah of Hakel. What is it all about? What is the theme of Hakel beyond the simple meaning, the simple words of instilling a fear of God in the people? By the way, this ceremony called Hakel that took place once in 7 years was always on the year following the sabbatical year. It happens to be that last year on the Jewish calendar was a sabbatical year, which makes this year a year of Hakel, the year when, would we have a temple, we would observe this mitzvah, this once in 7 years mitzvah. Now that we don't have a temple, we have to observe this mitzvah in a spiritual way. So we have to appreciate the significance of this mitzvah, this gathering. What is it all about? We turn to Maimonides. Maimonides is one of the codifiers of the Torah. He has a book where he takes all the mitzvahs, all 613 laws, and he describes them in great detail. And one of the things that he writes about the mitzvah of Hakel is that the thrust of this law, this commandment, was to replicate and to allow us to relive the revelation at Sinai. In other words, out of all 613 commandments in the Torah, this is the one where every single Jew had to be present. And if you could imagine the energy of so many people coming together, proclaiming their allegiance to God, it was an awesome experience to be there. It must have been. And the energy was palpable. So we're supposed to imagine ourselves receiving the Torah once again, just like back at Sinai. All Jews were present. Says Maimonides, this was reenacted every 7 years. And this is how he puts it. It is a positive commandment to gather together the entire Jewish people, men, women, and children, after every sabbatical year, when they ascend for the pilgrimage holiday of Sukkot. The Jewish king reads passages from the Torah that encourage them to perform mitzvot and strengthen them in their true faith. Scripture established Hakel exclusively for the purpose of strengthening true faith. A person should see themselves as if they were just now commanded regarding the Torah and heard it from God, for the king is an agent to deliver God's word. So what's interesting about this mitzvah, what was unique about Sinai, is that it brought Judaism to life. The revelations that the Jewish nation experienced at Mount Sinai gave them a certain strength and energy to realize that this is real, this is true, and we have to commit ourselves to following God's path. So prior to this, a person might have faith on an abstract level. But this, living through this experience in the days of the temple, really made it alive, because it was designed to replicate the monumental revelation at Sinai with all Jews present, and to allow the people to experience that and to relive it. As he says here, Sinai took the people's faith from cognitive to visceral. It's not just some idea that I learned about in the books. It's something that I feel with every part of my body. I feel the connection. And there's a certain energy that you get from connecting with all people at the same time and realizing that you all have this in common. So the sea change that occurred at Sinai is not so much that the Jews learned Torah or heard the mitzvahs from God. In other words, it's not just about information, transmitting knowledge. After all, those things happened before Sinai as well. The patriarchs studied Torah. But the major change that happened at Sinai is that Jews were able to actually see it. They were able to experience it, and it became real. As is well known, seeing something is incomparable to hearing about it. When you hear about something, you hear about it from a distance, which is why abstract things can only be heard through cognitive processes, but not seen. Visuals, by definition, are up close, which is why only tangible items can be seen, and why seeing something makes it so real. Seeing is believing. This is what happened at Sinai when the nation saw the thunder, as our sages say. Thunder is something you normally only hear, but here they saw it. In other words, they were able to experience the authenticity of God as close to them as something which you normally see with your physical eyes. It wasn't just about remembering a historical event that took place at Mount Sinai. It was to replay it and to relive it, to strengthen the faith in the people. The people have to recharge their batteries. And it's interesting, the Abarbanel, one of the classic commentators, writes that if Hakel were to happen every year, it would lose its novelty. It wouldn't have the same impact. The fact that it happened only once in 7 years allowed the people to be inspired and strengthened for at least the next 7 years. It had a lasting impression. And this is what the Rebbe says. How would the people for all time, after the events at Sinai, be able to experience the feeling of seeing God, simply memorializing the events at Sinai would not be enough. A memory is from the past. The person stands at a distance. There was a special event which was called Hakel, where every Jew, man, woman, and child, gathered together as they did at Sinai and envisioned themselves as if they were now directly hearing the word of God through the king's agency, through the king's delivery. So it's interesting that throughout all these readings, we have these two ideas of fearing God, and being inspired next to each other. How does that make sense? Usually when you talk about inspiring somebody, it's not through fear. So why are we focusing so much on fearing God, right? In order to inspire us, to strengthen our commitment.
Rabbi Goldman, because
yes,
God made us complex. He made us complex. It's always a struggle to balance it all out. The fear is a good fear. It's not a bad fear.
Exactly.
It's an awe. Yeah, it's an awe. It's an awe, and
so it's not the type of fear that you feel when you're facing a raging bull that's coming to attack you, right? Like he says here, it's designed to inspire us, to empower us, right? And that's the type of awe and fear that we're talking about.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you, Rabbi.
Now, the central character in this mass assembly of the Jewish people in the temple was the Jewish king. The king would read the Torah in front of all the people. He was the vehicle through which God's word would be communicated to the people. And that event would evoke a sense of fear and inspiration for the people. Now, we're a little bit removed from that era of the royal monarchy. You know, I don't know if there's somebody alive today that you could say, if you were in their presence, you would feel that sense of fear or reverence. But when we had a king, when Jews had a king, the king was actually an embodiment of these two elements. Number one, the king was the most powerful person in the entire nation. Let's have a look at some of the laws of kings to appreciate who this individual was. Maimonides tells us that the king must be treated with great honor. We must implant awe and fear of him in the hearts of all men. We may not ride on his horse, nor sit on his throne, use his scepter, wear his crown, use any of his utensils. When he dies, they should all be burned before his bier. Similarly, only another king is allowed to make use of his servants, maids, and attendants. Anyone who rebels against the king of Israel may be executed by the king. He goes on and on. If you embarrass the king, you could be executed. So the point is that with the authority that this king had, there was no trial to talk about. The king could just decide to kill somebody outright if they blink the wrong way. So you could imagine the type of terror that the people would feel in his presence of such a powerful person. And yet, this very same individual, this powerful leader, was also required to be exceedingly humble. As Maimonides continues, just as the Torah grants the king great honor and obligates everyone to revere him, so too the Torah commands the king to be lowly and empty at heart. As the verse says, my heart is a void within me. He should not treat people with overbearing haughtiness. As it says, the king should not lift up his heart above his brothers. The king should be gracious and merciful to the small and the great, involving himself in their good and welfare. He should protect the honor of even the humblest of men. So the question is, how do these two things go together? How can a king be simultaneously all-powerful and inspire fear in the people, and at the same time be exceedingly humble? It's kind of like the question that we asked, how does inspiration and fear come together? How do we mention them together in the same episode? So what did the Rambam say earlier? What did Maimonides describe during the Hakel ceremony? Describes the king as an agent to deliver God's word. And that's the key. The key is what the king represents. His honor and his power were not for himself. It was what he represented, what he stood for. The king was God's messenger. And his personal humility, together with his ultimate power, is not a contradiction. The fact that he represented God and he saw himself as a messenger of God, that's what allowed him to be humble before all people. And that's also what evoked a sense of honor and fear from the people, recognizing that this person is a human being, but a messenger of God. So the king was God's ambassador. The king, in his own personal life, the king was supposed to be entirely surrendered to God. In other words, the level of surrender was supposed to be so deeply seared into his heart that it would be physically impossible to feel arrogant or to harbor any sense of ego. The king was supposed to be before God as an inanimate stone lacking any movement. The purpose of appointing a Jewish king is that through him, the Jews can surrender to God. Every Jew must surrender to the king and follow his command. Now, inasmuch as the king totally surrenders to God and the Jews surrender to him, it emerges that through him, the Jews surrender themselves before God. And so this is the king's job, to connect and submit the Jewish people to God by way of his own surrender. So the king was a role model of a person in a true relationship with God, who is humbled by the privilege of that relationship. But at the same time, the king recognized his position of honor and power. He didn't walk into the temple, hunched over, feeling timid and small. The king walked in tall and proud. There was a platform that was built especially for this occasion. As the Talmud says, they would make this wooden platform in the temple courtyard where he sat royally on a throne, because he was acting as God's messenger and everything that represented. So when we think of ourselves as people who are accepting upon ourselves the authority of God and developing, cultivating a fear of heaven, It's not a contradiction to being inspired, because accepting God's authority requires surrender and hard work. But at the same time, it's not meant to make us feel small. It's meant to empower us. The fact that we have the opportunity to accept God's sovereignty, to accept God as our king, we're fortunate enough to be one of God's servants, to serve the greatest king of all kings. So we cultivate a sense of Kabbalah's oil, a sense of obedience, recognizing and accepting upon ourselves God's authority, which is a humbling approach. In fact, this is the beginning of how we start off each day. In the morning, when we wake up in the morning and we recognize that God has restored our soul and given us strength to face all the challenges of that day, the code of Jewish law tells us that we're supposed to wake up in the morning as strong as a lion, with the attitude that we're ready to serve our Creator. There's many creatures in the jungle, in the wild, that are mighty and strong. But it says you should be strong like a lion. Why a lion? Because the lion is the king of all animals. So we're supposed to wake up with a sense of pride, like a lion, and we recognize what we're here to serve, and through that, we'll be able to properly fulfill our obligations and our duties towards God. So the more we recognize this as a privilege, as an opportunity, we won't look at it as a burden, God forbid, but as being fortunate to serve God. So this lion-like strength that we use to serve God comes as a result of the fact that we view ourselves as God's messengers, as God's representatives, as God's ambassadors on earth, just like the king. Sometimes we have these inner demons and we have self-doubt. Who am I? How am I going to accomplish this great mission that God expects of me? But if I remember that God has given me lion-like strength to overcome any internal doubts that I might have, God empowers me to be a servant because I realize how significant the work that I'm doing is. So we set out to serve God, and the sages in the Talmud say that one should always incite his good inclination against his evil inclination. What does it mean to incite? Are we supposed to have a civil war between our good side and our evil side? The idea of the explanation is as follows. When it says one should incite his good inclination against his evil inclination, it includes behaving in a condescending, dismissive manner to our inner temptations. In other words, there's a certain sense of pride and empowerment that I feel being God's servant. That doesn't make me arrogant. It doesn't make me haughty because look at the position that I was given, but rather it keeps me in line, because I even though I might have these urges or temptations inside of me that are quite tempting, but I remind myself that I am a divine ambassador for God. How could I possibly stoop so low as to give in to these base urges? So I dismiss them, accepting God's authority, recognizing the position that I play as God's servant. I feel empowered. I have a sense of purpose. There's something larger than myself. I'm serving a higher power. And that gives me a sense of dignity that is beyond anything that I could achieve on my own. So the idea is not to instill fear in a negative way, but we should feel edified as God's ambassador on earth and empowered to serve him and to accept the authority of God, again, because of how we cherish this relationship. Accepting God's authority and fearing him must be in a manner that evokes a platform. If it's exclusively fear and submission, it can create feelings of deficiency and low self-worth. This would be counterproductive to anyone's religious duties. And so the king had a platform. We evoke the platform to incorporate feelings of assertiveness. As we said before, we're supposed to wake up in the morning strong as a lion. It empowers us to overpower our negative temptations. So just like we're talking about the importance of accepting God's authority as the ultimate authority in our lives, it also is true when it comes to the concept of fulfilling the mitzvah to fear God. It's not a paralyzing fear that's going to stop me from doing what I need to do. It's not a debilitating fear. As we said before, it's recognizing before whom we stand, in whose presence we are acting, in whose name we are empowered to be ambassadors on earth. And we're afraid of ruining that relationship because we cherish it. We love this relationship. We are afraid of doing anything that would undermine this special relationship. That's what this fear of heaven is all about. Are we clear? Any questions? No questions?
No.
Okay. So there's one more element here that I want to talk about, which is a side benefit to cultivating a healthy sense of awe and reverence for God. And that is the realization that there's nothing else in the world to be afraid of. In other words, if I'm truly afraid of ruining this relationship with God because I cherish this relationship so much, and I recognize and submit to God's authority, then the truth is that then there's nothing else to fear. This past Monday was the 18th day of Elul, and it was the birthday of two great luminaries. One was the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, and one was his successor, the Alter Rebbe, who was the founder of the Chabad movement. Now, the Baal Shem Tov was a fascinating personality. When he was 5 years old, he became an orphan from both his father and his mother. And right before his father passed away, his father told him Yisrolik, his nickname was Yisrolik, fear nothing but God alone. And as a young child, he lived with this. Throughout his life, he lived with this notion of not to fear anything but God. He would wander into the fields and the forests, and he would meditate and connect to God, even as a child. And there's one particular story where he's going into the forest and he hears a human voice. He follows the direction of the voice. He finds a Jew there who's praying. He hides behind the trees and he's listening to this man's prayers. He's enthralled. He thinks to himself, this man must be one of the 36 hidden tzaddikim, hidden people who are righteous and saintly. Nobody knows about them. And therefore he's hiding in the forest and praying to God, reciting the verses of Psalms in a melodious voice. And then he begins to do some Torah study. And he takes all his books and puts them in a sack, and he's about to walk away. This little child, Yisrael, the Baal Shem Tov, comes out from his hiding place, comes towards this man, and this man says, what is a young child doing in the forest all alone? Are you not afraid to be here by yourself? And what does the Baal Shem Tov answer him? He says, I like the field and the forest because there are no people, the great majority of whom are arrogant and dishonest. I'm not afraid of anything. I'm an orphan without father or mother. My father, peace be upon him, said to me before his passing, Yisraelik, fear nothing but God alone. And so I'm not afraid of anything. Once we realize that God is in charge, God is in control, nothing can happen in this world without God, that automatically invokes a sense of awe and reverence towards God, where I become fearful of doing anything that God doesn't want me to do. But at the very same time, I'm empowered with a sense of confidence. And I have a certain peace of mind, knowing that I have nothing else to be concerned about. Nothing else can cause me stress or anxiety, because ultimately, nobody else is in control. There's nothing to be afraid of. It's only God. So when I have to make these decisions in my life, whether it's a moral decision, an ethical decision, spiritual decision, I submit to God's authority. I recognize, I ask myself, first of all, is this something that God approves of? Is this something that God would want me to do? because I have accepted that authority. And once I confirm that this is in line with what God has in mind for me, then there's nothing else to be worried about. As the previous Rebbe once said, accepting God's authority and the sincere fear of heaven are the keys that open the lock to every one of the heavenly chambers. So this is very timely because we are in the month of Elul. We're in a time of divine mercy, where God makes himself most accessible to each one of us, as long as we're willing to reach out and recommit to strengthening our relationship with God, accepting God's authority in our lives. And that's not going to weaken us. On the contrary, that's going to empower us. It's going to make us stronger. As we prepare for the days of awe, the days of judgment, it's a time where we can reach out to God, and God is merciful and compassionate and willing to listen to our pleas and our requests to inscribe us and seal us in the book of life for a good, sweet new year. And all we have to do is be willing to connect in a deep way, in a personal way, recognize the privilege, how fortunate we are to be able to have this relationship with God. And once we do that, we have a peace of mind, knowing that there's nothing to be afraid of, there's nothing to be fearful of, because ultimately God is there for us. God is there to protect us and to give us all the blessings that we need for the year ahead. Any thoughts or questions?
Rabbi, when you just said that, all I could think about is to have good health and to have peace. That's what I thought about when you just said.
Those are good blessings to ask for.
Yes. Because if you can have everything else, but if you don't have those things, it doesn't matter, especially your health.
Well, I'll just add to your list.
There's plenty, I'm sure.
in addition to praying for physical health,
Mental.
I think it's important to ask to pray for spiritual health as well.
Yes.
Because when our bodies are whole and wholesome, that's part of it. That's part of what we need. But we also need a wholesome soul. And when the soul is nourished and getting the nutrients that it needs, then it can complement the health of the body. So we turn to God and we ask for physical health and spiritual health at the same time. Kevin, you had a question?
I have lots of questions, but I'll just ask one because there's too many. And this is a very interesting class. I'm glad that I got Zoom back this morning, and only because for you. That's the only reason I'm doing this. I'm curious, though, who raised the Baal Shem Tov? If he was orphaned at 5.
It's a very interesting question.
Somebody must have had an incredible influence on him.
So, yeah, so he was raised with other orphans, but the stories are that he would wander off into the forest alone, and the people who were responsible for raising him got upset with him because that's it's not safe for a little child to go alone in the forest. And yet, this is what he did. He was totally fearless. And in the forest is where he ended up meeting these holy mystics, people who were great saints, but I guess hidden. Nobody really knew about them. They disguised themselves as ordinary people. They would come into the town and nobody would think that they're anything special, but they were really truly righteous mystics. And he befriended them, and he learned from them. And it wasn't until the age of 36 years old that the Baal Shem Tov actually made himself known as a spiritual leader to others. So up until that time, he was kind of a hidden personality, and nobody really knew his greatness until the time came where his mentors and teachers instructed him to go out there and go public and become a leader. So it was an interesting journey that he had.
Rabbi Goldman, could they be considered like angels? We've talked about angels a lot. The men in the forest, were they real, or were they angels?
They were actually people. They were actually human beings, not angels. But there was this tradition that, in every generation, there were a number of these. They say there were 36 of these individuals who nobody knew of their greatness. Nobody knew how holy and saintly they were, because they disguised themselves as ordinary people. And yet there was this kind of hidden society of great mystics. So the Baal Shem Tov learned from these people.
God sure had a path for him, didn't he?
Yep. But really what was ingrained in him from that early age of 5 years old was his father's parting words. And his father tells him, do not be afraid of anyone other than God. And really that shaped his outlook on life.
Rabbi, I wanted to wish your family a blessed upcoming new year. You should continue to be the light upon all of us, teaching us Torah and wisdom, and bringing the mission of the Rebbe into the world fulfilled.
Thank you for your blessing, Sophia. And God willing, we should all fulfill the mission with which God has entrusted us. And God willing, next Thursday, we'll have a special Rosh Hashanah class to get us into the spirit of the new year. So because we don't have because next week Rosh Hashanah, actually Shabbat, Rosh Hashanah happens to be on Shabbat this year, so we won't be reading the regular Torah portion next Shabbat. We're reading the special Rosh Hashanah reading. So our class next week will be about the deeper meaning of the shofar blowing ceremony that happens on Rosh Hashanah, and we'll be able to prepare for that together next Thursday, God willing. So have a wonderful week, everyone.
Thanks, Rabbi. Thank you.
And
Rabbi,
thanks for joining us.
thank you. It was great to see you again.
Thank you. All the best.